Numbers, there is a prophet named Balaam who is hired by this group of people who two different ways to corrupt Israel. One is by pronouncing curses. The other is by having Israelite men intermarry with pagan foreign women so that they would be idolatrous and leave their God for the God of the women that they marry. Guess which group of people that these wives were taken to lure Israel away from their God? It was from two groups, basically, the Midianites and the Moabites. And so in the actual biblical story, it's not even just that this woman, Ruth, is a foreigner. She is the type of foreigner which in just a few books earlier was literally used to bring the downfall of the people into sin. Intermarrying with this very type of person, historically, why is that the case? And the reason is because, she does something that if you're taking in Judges together, the people of God didn't follow him, and now you have this foreign woman who's from a place, a foreign nation, that is not only not familiar with Yahweh, the God of the Jews, but they are constantly at war with those people, and in fact have tried to destroy those people, whether it be militarily or religiously. And here is where we find Ruth. Her introduction here is interesting. In chapter 1, it says, that in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine. And the famine is interesting because a famine continually is something that has moved the patriarchs. Even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of them were moved to do something, to go somewhere important by a famine. Abraham flees the land of Canaan and goes to Egypt because of a famine. Isaac goes to live with King Abimelech of the Philistines during a famine where God makes him yield 100-fold of his crops. Jacob, in the story of Joseph, if you are familiar with Jacob and his favorite son Joseph, that was all centered around a famine. In fact, multiple famines. Those famines have been ways that God has moved people to do certain things, to leave certain places for a variety of reasons all throughout the story. And here we have one again. There was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. Bethlehem, pretty important city later in the story, as you guys probably well know why Bethlehem becomes very significant. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And so she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. This family leaves so that they can find food in a foreign place. And while they're there, the 2 sons take Moabite wives. One is named Orpah and the other Ruth. We don't really know anything else about Orpah. She disappears from the story after this chapter. But the other is Ruth. And in the biblical story broadly, intermarrying with foreign pagan women has resulted in a grand total of 0 great things, almost always. I mean, very, very seldom does any other result appear when the Israelites marry women who are, it's not just that it's like a racism thing. It's not like our people have a certain skin tone and the foreign women have a different skin tone, and that skin tone is one we don't like. That's not the point. The point is they worship the gods of their people. And when the men intermarry with the women, it's never that the women begin worshiping the husband's gods. It's always the opposite, that they begin worshiping the pagan gods. And you would imagine this is probably what's going to happen. If you've read the biblical story thus far, you would think that I can predict what's going to happen when these guys marry Moabite wives. The family is not going to be a faithful one. And we will see what happens. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." She wants him to go get married. Because, your husband's died. I'm old. I can't make any more kids for you. And even if I could have kids, are you going to wait around for them to grow up and then marry you? That's too long. It'll never work. You need to go back to your home country because I'm going back to mine. And what we know is that the one decided she would leave, but the other, Ruth, decided that she would stay. But staying, here's what begins to separate Ruth from every other Moabite woman that we've met in the scriptures thus far. Here's what begins to separate them. When Naomi says, "Leave and go back to your home country," she is making the case that if you want to be a mother and a wife and to have a family, which is tantamount in this society to having any kind of financial security, because you can't work and have your own job, you can't own land, you can't own property, have a farm. That's not how it works. You have to have a husband, or you are going to be poor for the rest of your life. You will be simply begging and getting scraps from the edges of people's fields at harvest time. That is the best you could ever hope for if you are a widow with no family, if you are someone who has no children. And when we read about the matriarchs from the early chapters of Genesis, the main ones being Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, the same thing happened to all of them, which is that they could not have any children. They were barren. But they were not barren for any other reason than some kind of biological reason. For some reason, they couldn't have kids until they were faithful to God and they called out to Him, and then God gave them children. Okay, well, then we get to Ruth, and Ruth is now presented with an option to go back to her family, to go back to her homeland, and to marry some Moabite man, and to possibly find a family and have children and have security. And she, unlike the matriarchs in Genesis, who were biologically barren against their will, what Ruth actually chooses is she opts in to barrenness. For all intents and purposes, if she stays with Naomi, she will not have any kids. As far as she knows, she will not have any more children. If she stays with Naomi, she will be a childless widow for the rest of her life. Not because she physically can't do it, but she's opting into it. She's choosing it out of love for Naomi. In fact, Naomi understands what the cost is if Ruth does not return home. What is the cost? She even says in chapter 1, verse 11, she says, "But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands?'" And then down in verse 13, she wants them to leave and says, "No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." The hand of the Lord has gone against me, and it's bitter. And if you stay with me, it will be bitterness for you too. You will have no husband and no children. So go back to your land and find one, and then you'll get the other. Find a husband, and then you can have children and security and a family and a hope and a future. And one of the daughters-in-laws says, "Okay, I'll go back." But Ruth decides that she would, out of love for Naomi, willingly forego the opportunity for a future hope and family, and she would opt in. She would literally choose functionally to be a barren woman, she's already a widow, but she's choosing functionally to live a life where she will not have any children. Why? Out of love for her mother-in-law. That's like stereotypically the joke, is that nobody likes their mother-in-law that much, It's like, that's kind of like a funny thing. Is like, I bought my mother-in-law, a new car for her birthday, and it was a broom. There's like just jokes like that. Now, my mother-in-law is great. And my wife's mother-in-law is great too. But you got to think like that's a pretty big cost. And you're talking about the fact that they've only been there for 10 years. Like, it's not like they've been lifelong close companions. These are two foreign people from two different nations, Naomi and Ruth, and they grow up in different places, and they've only been connected for a maximum of 10 years, maybe less. It's a big decision to make, but out of love for Naomi, she willingly opts in to the barrenness that the matriarchs of Genesis were praying for God to deliver them from. And why would she do that? Out of love for this woman who everyone in society would look around and say, that's a dumb decision. Why would you do that for this woman? Not only will she not have a family, but she will go into a nation where she is both a widow, she's also barren, like she doesn't have any children, and she's poor. And she is also a foreigner. All of those things are stacked up against her, and she willingly says, I will go and do that in order to stay with you. And here's what she says. Here's her reasoning in chapter 1, verse 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you, to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. And here's the most important part that separates her from every other foreign wife that we really encounter throughout the narrative. Here's what she says that separates Ruth. And your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me or more also, if anything but death departs me from you. In our society, in our world, the closest thing we have in society which mimics the covenant promises and the covenant love that God is demonstrating all throughout the Bible, the closest thing we have to that is marriage. That's why we take it serious. That's why we have it in the first place. That's why we won't have it, Jesus says, in heaven. In the New Testament, he's questioned, will we be married in heaven? He says there is no marriage in heaven. Why? Because the marriage we have here on earth is a reflection of something that we can experience now in part, that when we get to heaven we will experience in its whole. It's supposed to be a reflection of the covenant love and promises that God shows to his people. And the way that you walk with God, the way that you obey God, is to, as you receive that covenant love, that special love that says, I will be your God and you shall be my people. The way that you reflect that, the way that you walk with God is to reflect that love out to the people around you in your life circumstances. And that's why the Bible cannot be just broken down to just a list of rules, and if you follow this set of rules, then that's enough. That's not the point. The point is, you ever think in your life, I wish that whatever I was going through, there was a verse in the Bible specifically dedicated to this, business transaction where I need to know what's the right move and what's not. I wish that there was a map in the Bible, and if I open it and I pray, the map will have like a pin drop on it and tell me where I should move or what college I should go to. Like, I wish that there was something so specific in the Bible that I could read a verse that's specifically dedicated to me. Or I wish there were verses in the Bible that talked about how to deal with AI in the world. There are things that I'm dealing with in the world that there's no Bible verses for. I don't know how necessarily to deal with that. But the point of the Bible is not to give you a list of rules to follow, and not the point of the Bible is to show you a love which you are to reflect in every area of your life. And when you don't know how you might do that, you pray to God for wisdom, and he will show you. Ruth is a person who did not have the upbringing that the people of Israel would have had with the scrolls and with the priests and with the Levitical law and with sacrifices and with the tabernacle and with the festivals and the feasts. She had zero of that. She had none of it. And yet, she reflected, remember we're taking Ruth and Judges together, this foreigner reflected the covenant love of God in a way that nobody in the nation of Israel, the very people of God, were doing for a few hundred years. That's why she's different than all the other foreign wives. That's why she gets her own book of the Bible. That's why it's interesting when you consider Judges, God's very people not obeying him, and a foreigner who doesn't know God, not born into him, acting like the people were supposed to. And what is the result of that? What is the result of this kind of love and commitment? Because here's the thing. When you make a decision for the Lord, oftentimes the reward or the thing we might feel or the blessing we receive from it is usually in comparison to the cost that we have paid. When I find out about my brothers and sisters in Christ who live in other parts of the world, their walking with God comes at an enormous cost that none of us here have ever paid. And I guarantee that if the cost to attend church, to worship together with believers, was even half as high as it is for many Christians across the world, that if that cost was the same or even half of what that cost is for us here today, that I guarantee whatever number that the ushers will count and put on that board back there, that number would be a lot lower. And I don't know, I'm simply asking myself when I read about the saints of the past who were willing to endure incredible persecution and pay enormous costs, I have to ask myself, would I pay that cost? Would I die for it? Would I allow my family to die for it? What was the cost? Well, nobody necessarily was threatening to kill Ruth's family, but if she believes in Christ, at the moment she decides, there's a guarantee that if she decides to stay with Naomi, she will never receive a family. She's giving up the hope of ever having a family. And she says, out of love, I will choose your people and your God no matter what. So that's the cost that she paid, and she decided to do it out of love. And so they return back to, in verse 19, the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem, which is where Naomi is from. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitterness. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." And you see what's interesting about Naomi making this statement is the emptiness which she feels has been brought upon her by the Lord and is a shame to her when she returns to her homeland is the very emptiness that Ruth has voluntarily chosen to endure and live in for the rest of her life until death out of love for Naomi. Not only is Naomi widowed and she's not going to have any more kids, but now she's back home, and now here's a problem. You are in a society where you can't go out and get a job like women might be able to today. So how is she going to eat? How is she going to pay for her things? How is she going to survive in this world? How is it going to happen? Well, she can't do it. She is elderly. And so Ruth has to do it for her. Not only has Ruth signed up not to ever have a family as far as she knows, but she's also signed up to be the physical labor, the manual labor, which provides not only for her own self, but for another person as well. So she's committed herself to a life of abject poverty, gleaning. There are these things called gleaning laws, which is basically like a social safety net in Israelite society, where if you had a field, there was like a certain amount of rows in these rows of your harvest that you were supposed to leave a certain amount of harvest around all the edge of your field for the poor. And the poor, you were supposed to leave a little bit there so that they could glean from the edges of your field. And that's how they would provide for the poor. That's like a social safety net in ancient society. And so, but there are a lot of people vying for those leftover pieces of the harvest, and there's not a lot to go around. They've just had a famine. And so Ruth, however, she is tasked with this assignment to go and glean and to provide not only for herself but for Naomi. In chapter 2, verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And so she goes and she gleans in the field of Boaz. And Boaz is an older man, but he seems to be a wealthier man. And she gleans in his fields, and he begins to notice that she's a little bit different from those around her. And he asks his servant, who is this woman, and he says, "This is Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi." And Boaz, in chapter 2, verse 8, goes to her and gives her instructions. "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men drawn." So he protects her from being assaulted by other men out there. He gives her not only just the scraps of one field, but he allows her to go into a different field and to glean with his own servants, not the other poor people gleaning around the edges, but to gather wheat with his own servants and those women. And he's told his men, "Don't touch this woman." And he said, "If you're thirsty, you can go and drink out of our wells." Well, that's a pretty good deal. And she asked him in chapter 2, verse 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me." Why would he do any of these things for her? But many people would have heard about Ruth's situation and said, why would Ruth do any of those things for Naomi? And so in the decision for her to leave what she could have had out of love and to serve Naomi, apparently the word had gotten around, and it was because of that decision that Boaz is treating her this way. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." So here's where he gives a blessing, where he wants something good to happen for her. He says in chapter 2, verse 12, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord." Normally, the Lord is like an Israelite guy, and now this is a Moabite woman, but she's acting like an Israelite. She's acting like a person who believes in Yahweh in a way that the Israelites of that time, remember, this is when Judges is happening. Like if you're reading the book of Judges, a subplot under the last section of Judges, that's when Ruth is alive and doing her thing. That is the reason. Her decision, her covenant love for her mother-in-law is the reason that Boaz has treated her like this, and the reason that he asks the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. It makes you wonder, what does a person have to do to show the fruits of belief in their life? Like, how many pieces of theology do you have to know? How many doctrines must you memorize? How many verses must you be able to recite in order to be considered a follower of God? What is it that you have to know to be saved? I think it's a lot less than people might expect. You see, the verses that you memorize, that's a good thing. But memorizing verses and just gathering information into your head, though that is not a bad thing in and of itself, how does it come out in the fruits of how you live your life? If you say you believe, Do you live like somebody who actually believes? Because I guarantee you, the Israelites around her, they know more verses of the Torah. They've memorized more verses of the Torah than Ruth has ever. Ruth may have never even heard much of it. I guarantee you that they've gone to the tabernacle more times than Ruth had ever gone. And I guarantee you that they've participated in more Passover celebrations than Ruth has ever participated in. So who's the greater believer? Who's actually living out, walking with God? The person who has memorized the verses, or the person who's given up everything they could have had in order to live out a life that is a reflection of the love God has shown to her? Which one of the two? If you take Judges and Ruth and you compare them together, you have Israelites acting wicked and you've got foreigners acting in faith. And that's the Bible intentionally telling you that God's people are not born by blood, but by belief. You can be a part of the family of God even if you're not born into it. Now, there are people who are born as Jews who are also faithful believers, and that's just a great blessing for them. But there are many people. We've already met Rahab as well. Rahab, a person who you would never think should be allowed to be in the holy people of God, set apart to be priests among all the nations. You would never think Rahab would get to be one of them, but she acted like a person who really believed, even if I don't know how, I know that this God is in control and I will give all of my trust to Him. And whatever happens is in His control and I will give Him my life. She actually acted like she believed it because she did. And so when we think about what does it mean to be a faithful person, to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Christ? What does that mean? There are metrics, all kinds of metrics that you might use, that people have tried to use over the centuries to determine whether or not they are good Christians. And one that is very well known, that's very popular, is how much do you attend the services? And attending the services is not inherently a bad thing, but attending the services doesn't make you a believer. Attending the services doesn't mean that you have given Him your life, that you have trusted in Him, especially for us today, because attending the service comes at no social cost to you. You can, in fact, in certain periods of time, if you were a Christian, there would be benefit for you going to the services. What about when it comes at a cost? How much are you willing to give up so that the Lord can be first in your life? For Ruth, she was willing to live in abject poverty in service to a woman she is not known for very long, just so that she might have Yahweh as her God. And the Bible holds this up as what it means to be a true Israelite. If the Israelites are the people of God, set apart from everyone else, she's living like it, and the people who were born as descendants of Abraham were not living that way, and the book of Judges is a record of how wicked they actually were. And here you have this Moabite woman who has barely survived a famine and is trying to provide for herself and her mother-in-law by just picking scraps out of the fields. She has given all her trust to God and voluntarily placed herself in what the society around her would say is a bad position. For her, that's a bad decision, and yet she has done it because she said, I will trust in the Lord until death. In chapter 3, Naomi hears about this good interaction that she had with Boaz, and she concocts this plan to try and convince Boaz to marry her. But there's something in Israelite culture that you and I don't have. We don't understand. It's very different. It's called Goel. A Goel is a kinsman redeemer. You have to think about this. There in the Promised Land, the Bible considers to be an inheritance. The people of God receive this land as an inheritance from Him. They didn't do anything to earn it. He just gives it to them because He loves them. and he wants what's best for them. And so they get a part of the inheritance. And the inheritance, in the boring parts that you probably skip through in your reading about who gets what part of the inheritance and the geographical boundaries and surveys, the purpose of that is to say this part of the inheritance is for this part of the people. You know, these people get this section, and that will be a phrase that's often used in those passages. That will be their inheritance forever. And so you have problems about, okay, if somebody dies and their kid inherits it, but what if they only have daughters, and the daughters marry to another tribe, and then does that tribe inherit a piece of another tribe's land? How does that all work out if this is supposed to be an eternal inheritance for my tribe? You have a lot of these disputes. And one of the ways they resolved these was by a kinsman redeemer. And this means that someone from your tribe has, I think in real estate you call it, or in business maybe, the first right of refusal. Like I get the chance to buy it first. That's what a kinsman redeemer is, and it usually applies to the land. So if you own a massive farm and you die and you have no sons and you have no brothers, then your next of kin, your closest cousin or your closest nephew or something like that, he would get the first chance to buy your land. But the other stipulation is, whatever your family inheritance was, if there was a servant or if there was a widow that lived on that land, if you buy the land, you get her as well. And you have to take care of her. The other aspect of the kinsman redeemer is something called a levirate marriage. If you're the oldest and you die, then your little brother, the next youngest brother, has to marry your wife so that your name doesn't die with you, so that you can have some children. That's how they did it, so that your family got to keep your part of the inheritance forever. That's the rule. And Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, but apparently he's not the closest one. There's somebody else in front of him. But he, because of this scheme they put together, Naomi and Ruth, he wants to marry her. And he sees that she's been faithful to God, and he wants to marry her, but he doesn't have first place. And so in chapter 4, he goes to the man who has first place. And in chapter 4, verse 1, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, that's the person in first place there, the first kinsman, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. And they sat down. And then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And so he initially pitches it like, there's some land for sale, and you have the first chance to buy it. The first right of refusal goes to you, because you're the closest kin. And the guy says, land? I like land. I'll buy it. And at the end of verse 4, and he, the Redeemer, said, I will redeem it. He said, I'll buy it. And then Boaz said, well, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. This is a small way, if you ever read a passage where it starts with Moses at the burning bush, take off your shoes, for this is holy ground. Or Joshua in front of the angel of the Lord's armies says, take off your sandals, for the land you're standing on is holy ground. Taking off your sandals was a sign of depossession. If you have your sandals on and you're standing on the land, the symbol was like that you're standing on this land, you have a right to it. When you take off your shoes, they were admitting in their culture that they did not have a right to this land. The reason you take your shoes off on the holy ground is because it's not yours. So whenever they do this custom, Boaz wants to buy it, and in front of everybody, the guy says, I don't want to buy it because of Ruth. And so that guy, the Redeemer, he takes off his sandal, and one of them, and he gives it to Boaz as a sign of depossession. Like, in front of these witnesses, here's my sandal. I'm depossessing my right to you, Boaz. Now it's yours. And Boaz takes it. And chapter 4, verse 9, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belong to Elimelech, Chilion and Mahlon. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place, witnesses to this day. So then here's the response of these people. Now, you might think that a wealthy Jewish businessman who lives right in the center of the tribe of Judah, the biggest tribe, that him making this public declaration that I'm going to marry a Moabite woman, that is not going to go over well. But what do the people say? The elders around him say, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. And so the elders, they give it their blessing. All the elders, his intermarriage to this foreign woman, and give it their blessing. And then it gets even more legitimate. In verse 13, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Now here's where the book of Ruth begins to get even more interesting. This is a foreign woman. The whole situation she's in started because of a famine, which we saw in both Abraham's family, Isaac's family, and Jacob's family. Those are the families where Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah, his two main wives, they are the matriarchs of all of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are the matriarchs of all Jews. And now we have a story that starts with similar conditions with this famine, but we have someone who's very different. She's not from Abraham's descendants. She's from a foreign place, and now she's intermarrying with a Jewish man, which has always been against the rules. Now she's intermarrying with a Jewish man, and the elders sitting around, they pray, give this blessing. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. Those are matriarchs. Now they're asking God that this marriage, this redemption, this kinsman redeemer, that his marriage to Ruth would make Ruth and their house just like the matriarchs in Genesis, which is a pretty big deal. That's like being in pretty elite company for Jews. And then in verse 13, the Lord does that. So the Lord gave her conception. All the matriarchs in Genesis, they were all barren biologically. Ruth had become barren by choice out of her covenant love for her mother-in-law. And barren, whether by choice or biologically, they were all barren until what? Until God gave them a child, which made the child and the circumstances of that child's conception very miraculous. And certainly in the story of Ruth with Boaz and the deaths of the husbands and the famine and Naomi and all of that situation, that this is quite a miraculous series of events, and the Lord gave her conception. But it gets even greater. Verse 14, the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you," is what they're saying to Naomi, "who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." And Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to him. They named him, was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so not only does, it's not even just that this is an interesting story where like a foreign woman finds a nice guy to marry, the end. That's not the point at all. In fact, perhaps that happened all throughout Israel and we just don't have record of it because it doesn't really matter to the whole narrative. But this woman, who acted out a reflection, a mirror of God's covenant love to his people, acted it out better than the Jews themselves, who are all wicked in the book of Judges. This woman not only acted in covenant love herself, but was rewarded and redeemed by this man. And the reward for her love was not only the marriage to Boaz, but was the son. And this son was no regular son. This son was the actual grandfather of King David. Now, King David is probably probably top 5 Jews of all time, if you had to put him up. He's up there pretty high, maybe higher than that. He's top 5 Jew of all time. This woman is not, she's not a Jew at all. And you would think, how could this, like this is a nice story, but why does this woman get her own book of the Bible? Like of all the people who could have got their own book, she gets her own book. That's crazy. Why would she get her own book? I remember somebody saying to me, like a really good question about the Bible. He said, sometimes I read the Bible and I'm like, who is Ruth and why do we care what happened to her? And I was like, you know what? Sometimes you're reading the Bible, you got to ask, like, why is this person in here? And is it just because we want to know the genealogy of where David came from? I mean, maybe. Maybe that's part of it. But the most important phrase in all of this comes from Ruth's decisions in chapter 1, where she says to Naomi, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And more than any other, the metaphor for God's people and his church today that I think rings the most true, that's the most commonly used, that is the most important for us to remember today is that the people of God are the family of God. And how can you be part of the family? Can you force your way into it? No. You have to either be born into it, or you're adopted into it, or you're married into it. But anybody can come into the family by choice. And if you think, well, we don't need the Old Testament because we have the New Testament. And the New Testament's better than the Old, and the Old has things that I don't understand in situations that are weird. And why is this guy throwing a sandal at the other guy to sign a deal? What's the deal with all of this? And why does he have to marry a woman just to buy their property? I don't understand what the deal is. We don't need the Old Testament. Well, I want you to know that the things you see in the New Testament, they didn't just pop out of thin air. God is the same yesterday and today and forever. And so the very same God who was acting in the Old Testament was doing things that the New Testament simply describes in greater detail. If you were to break it down, and you say like, oh, I like New Testament terms, not Old Testament terms, here's what it is. Ruth is a woman who has no claim to the promises of God. She doesn't have a birthright to it. Her parents don't know it. She's never worshipped it before. But when she comes into contact with God, somehow, it doesn't even explain where she first heard about it, obviously somehow through Naomi and her family, but when she comes into contact with God, she says, I believe in him and I will trust him with my life and my future, whatever else may come. I will give him my hope. I will give him my future. It all belongs to him. That is, if you could bottle it down into a word, that is what we call faith. That you believe that this God can do something in the future, and you don't know what it is, but it's worth giving your life to. That is what it is like to walk with God. And if you're a person who I only make decisions when I know all the details, God is going to make it even harder for you to find out all the details before he asks you to make a decision. You are going to have to make a decision that the people around you think, hey, you know what? It's maybe not the most profitable decision for you. You know what? You could actually make a decision that would earn you more money, that would actually promise you a better future. Why would you make a decision based on some religious belief that would cost you money? That's not wise. The people around you are going to think that some of the decisions you may make as a follower of God will cost you. And the answer to that is, yes, that is true. In fact, paying the cost is part of the faith. And the worst thing that has happened for us as Christians in the United States is that in some way the most detrimental thing to our faith has been that it costs us nothing. You could come and participate in everything that any church does, and if you don't like this church, you don't have to stick with us. If you get in an argument with anybody here, you can just drive to Mosaic or Blooming Grove or First Baptist. If you like bigger churches, you can go to Mosaic or First Baptist downtown. If you like smaller churches, you can come here or you can go to any of your heart's desires. If you like a certain type of songs being sung during church, you can go to a church that sings those songs. And if you want to pay tithes and support the church, you can do that. But if you don't want to, you don't have to do that. I mean, let's be honest. You can participate in almost everything that a church does out there as far as programs. They'll give away free stuff, and you can have so much access to what churches do, and it costs you nothing. In fact, it could be of much, perhaps, social benefit to you. You meet good people. You know people you can trust. People may frequent your business because they know you're a guy that goes to church or you're a lady that goes to church. And that's a good thing socially, you might think. But when Jesus comes and he calls his disciples, they're asking to bury their parents, and he says, if you won't forsake your own mother and father for me, you cannot be my disciple. That's almost verbatim what it says that Ruth did. Leaving behind her mother and her father and her country and her people for Yahweh, for the Lord. What cost are you willing to pay? Where's the line where you say, like, God can ask me for this much, but no more. I won't go past this. Because usually, as I have found out to be the case in my life, if I say, here's a line, I won't cross this, that's the first thing that God's going to ask me to do. And when we were becoming missionaries, my mom said, I'll go anywhere but India. My dad said, you better take it back because India is going to be the first place they tell us we have to go. If you don't take it back, we're going to be snake handling, burning up in India. That's what it's going to be. And I think that there's some truth to that, because when you say this thing is off limits, you can't have it, that's the thing God asked for. When Abraham finally has this miraculous child, what does God turn around and immediately say? I want you to sacrifice this child. And Abraham says, okay. And he was given a whole nation of children. There's a cost in your life that you say, I'll pay this much. But God wants you to be willing to give it all to him. He's not even going to necessarily take it all from you. In fact, if you are willing to give it, if you're not willing to give it, he might take some of it. Just to show you that he is enough. Well, I mean, for Ruth, it's enough. Just to have him, even if she's poor for her whole life and has no social status and no economic viability, God was enough. There's got to be a point in your life where you say, if I have God and the things in which I place my faith and my hope and my trust in him, if I have those things, that is enough. And anything else that he gives me is a blessing, and if he takes it away, so be it. Where's the line for you? How much cost are you willing to pay? At what point will you say, if I have God, I have enough? I want you to ask yourself that this week, and perhaps the Lord will reveal where your line is and ask you to trust him with it. Lord, we ask that you would be with us this week as we try to be faithful followers of you in the model of Ruth. Thank you that you have given the opportunity to everybody to be part of your family if they will by belief, by faith. If we place our faith in you, then we can be one of your children and can receive your inheritance. That inheritance in the Old Testament was land in the life of the believer today. That's a hope for our own version of the promised land, which is a future in heaven in eternal life with you. May we hold on to that promise in the face of all that we will experience and face this week, whatever things we're going through now, whatever new difficulties will crop up in the next few days, that we would hold on to that same promise that Ruth held on to. And may we say that no matter what, I will go where you go, and you will be my God. May that be the hope and the refrain of all of our people here today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Washed in the fountain, cleansed by his blood. Jesus, as we travel this sod, for I'm part of the family of God. You will notice we say brother and sister round here. It's because we're a family and these folks are so near. And one has a heartache, we all share the tears and rejoice in the victory in this family so dear. I'm so glad I'm a part of the family.
May the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you, and may he lift his countenance upon you and give you. If I could have Brother Timmy Parker, will you close us in prayer?